All right, so today we're diving into something pretty heavy.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about how effective law enforcement agencies are when it comes to dealing with white supremacist and far-right militant violence.
That's a big one for sure.
It is a big one, and to unpack all of this, we're going to be looking at this interview with Mike German.
Okay.
He is a former FBI agent and co-author of the book Policing White Supremacy, The Enemy Within.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so even the title itself, I mean,
Yeah, it's provocative.
it's pretty provocative, right?
Absolutely.
Like, it's sort of setting us up to ask, is there a problem within law enforcement when it comes to tackling this kind of extremism?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what he's trying to get at. And he uses this phrase, the enemy within. And it's interesting because I think it has a couple of layers to it.
Okay.
So first, he points out that white supremacist groups aren't just a domestic problem anymore.
Right.
They have connections all over the world.
Hmm.
So this idea that we can just treat them as like a purely internal issue is kind of outdated.
So you're saying that the line between domestic terrorism and international terrorism is getting blurrier.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second layer of meaning,
Oh, okay.
which is much more unsettling.
Oh.
German suggests that there might be sympathy or even active membership within law enforcement itself.
Whoa, hold on. So it's not just about, like, external threats.
Right.
It's about the potential for bias or even collaboration from people inside the very system that's supposed to be fighting this.
Precisely. And this is where I think German's background as a former FBI agent really comes into play.
But he's been there.
He's seen the inner workings of these institutions.
Yeah.
And he's arguing that simply giving law enforcement more power might actually make the problem worse.
But wait, isn't more power usually the answer when it comes to fighting crime? I mean, like more resources, more manpower. Those seem like good things, right?
It might seem that way on the surface.
Yeah.
But German makes a pretty compelling case that we need to look beyond these, like, quick fixes.
Oh.
He actually draws a direct line from historical practices like slave patrols to modern policing, arguing that the connection between law enforcement and white supremacy in America has deep, deep roots.
So this isn't just like a recent phenomenon?
Not at all, no.
Okay.
He brings up the example of Patrick Henry,
Oh, wow, yeah.
a major figure in American history
Huge.
who insisted on state militias as a condition for his support of the Constitution.
Right.
And what did he see these militias as? Basically slave patrols.
That's a pretty disturbing connection.
Yeah.
You know, I think a lot of people, myself included, tend to think of things like slave patrols and Jim Crow laws as mainly Southern issues.
It's easy to fall into that trap.
Yeah.
But German points out that these practices were enforced nationwide.
Really?
Oh, yeah. So, for example, fugitive slave patrols operated throughout the country. And black codes, which restricted the rights of black Americans, weren't limited to the South either.
Huh.
Like even groups like the Ku Klux Klan held sway in places like Southern California. This is a national problem.
Okay.
And German argues that its legacy still impacts us today.
So how does all of this historical context tie into the way we define and address terrorism in the present day?
That's a great question, and I think this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
German argues that since 9/11 in particular,
Right.
the term terrorism has become extremely politicized. And he uses a very powerful example to illustrate this point.
Okay, lay it on me.
So there was this man who blew himself up outside Trump Tower in Las Vegas.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Leaving behind these manifestos calling for violence against the government.
Oh.
He urged Americans to purge the government and military and move on D.C. militia style.
That's scary.
He even advocated for violence by any means necessary.
That's a chilling statement.
It is, but here's the thing. This individual wasn't widely labeled a terrorist.
Wait, what? Why not?
That's exactly the question German wants us to ask.
Okay.
Would the reaction have been different if this person wasn't a white man espousing right-wing views?
Right, right.
It makes you wonder if the focus is often more on the perceived threat to the government rather than the actual violence itself.
That's a really interesting point. It seems like the definition of terrorism gets applied very selectively.
That's German's argument.
Okay.
He believes the way we define terrorism has become skewed, prioritizing certain ideologies and downplaying others. And this feeds into a bigger issue that he highlights.
Which is?
The lack of comprehensive data on domestic terrorism, especially when it comes to white supremacist violence.
Yeah, he actually points out something that's pretty shocking, right?
Huh?
He says that the FBI, despite claiming that counterterrorism is its top priority,
Right.
doesn't actually collect data on domestic terrorism incidents,
Yeah.
including those related to white supremacy.
Yeah, and this lack of data is incredibly problematic
Right.
because it allows law enforcement to essentially pick and choose which groups they prioritize, potentially downplaying the threat posed by white supremacists.
Right. So you're saying that without this data,
Yeah.
they have the power to control the narrative.
It certainly raises questions about transparency and accountability.
For sure.
Yeah.
And this selective prioritization becomes even more apparent when you look at specific cases, which is something that German does in this interview.
Okay.
He contrasts the lenient treatment of Dylan Roof,
Right.
who murdered 9 black churchgoers in Charleston in 2015,
Horrible.
with the heavy-handed response to Stephen Paddock,
Yeah.
the Las Vegas shooter who killed 58 people in 2017.
Those cases really highlight the discrepancies.
Yeah.
Roof, even after committing such a horrific act of violence,
Right.
was treated with like a disturbing level of deference.
Yeah.
Police officers even took him to Burger King because he said he was hungry after the massacre.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Paddock, on the other hand, was immediately labeled a monster,
Right.
even though his motives remain unclear.
It's like there were 2 completely different standards at play.
And that brings up another point that German makes.
Oh, okay.
The way these cases are categorized.
Hmm.
Roof wasn't prosecuted as a terrorist, just a murderer.
Okay.
But others, like Paddock, are often labeled terrorists, even when their ideologies are less clear-cut.
So the question is, are these labels being applied consistently, or are they reflecting some kind of deeper bias within the justice system?
It's a crucial question that we need to grapple with.
For sure, and it leads us to, I think, a deeper dive into the legal framework surrounding domestic terrorism.
Right.
So what does the law actually say about domestic terrorism?
Well, this is where it gets interesting.
Okay.
There's this common misconception that there's no actual domestic terrorism law. But that's simply not true.
Oh.
The U.S. Code has an entire chapter dedicated to terrorism,
Okay.
defining both international and domestic terrorism based on geography.
Okay.
So violence within the U.S. falls under domestic terrorism. Violence outside the U.S. is classified as international. So it's pretty straightforward.
Then why does there seem to be so much confusion and inconsistency in how these cases are handled?
That's where things get a bit more complex.
Okay.
So you see, law enforcement agencies often create their own domestic terrorism categories based on ideology,
Okay.
but they don't necessarily collect data on which groups are actually posing the most persistent or serious threats.
So instead of focusing on the groups that are causing the most harm, they're prioritizing based on, what, political agendas?
It's possible, German suggests, that this allows them to focus on groups with less activity and less serious violence, while deprioritizing the most dangerous groups.
Wow.
Which in many cases turn out to be white supremacist organizations.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's saying there's a deliberate attempt to downplay the threat of white supremacy.
He doesn't explicitly say that.
Right.
But he does raise some important questions about transparency and accountability. And I think if we're going to effectively address the threat of white supremacist violence, we need to be honest about the scope of the problem.
Right.
And make sure resources are being allocated appropriately.
This goes beyond just data collection, though, right?
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging that there might be a systemic bias within law enforcement itself.
Exactly. And that's where German's perspective as a former FBI agent is so valuable.
Right.
He's seen the inner workings of these institutions.
Yeah.
And can offer insights that an outsider might not have.
So he's not just pointing fingers, he's offering potential solutions based on his experience.
Precisely, he argues that we need to completely reevaluate how we define and address terrorism.
Okay.
We need to move away from these politically motivated categories and start focusing on the actual harm.
So less about ideology and more about impact.
Exactly. We need to collect and analyze data on domestic terrorism incidents, including those related to white supremacy, to get a clearer understanding of the real threat landscape.
Okay.
And we need to make sure that law enforcement agencies are held accountable for how they prioritize and respond to these threats.
It's about creating a system that's truly equitable and effective.
Yeah.
One that protects all citizens equally, regardless of their race, religion, or political beliefs.
Precisely. It requires a fundamental shift in how we think about and approach the issue of white supremacy in this country.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. This is heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is.
But it's so important to talk about.
Absolutely.
You know, German really lays out the complexity of this issue, but he also doesn't shy away from offering like concrete steps we could take to address it.
He does, and he stresses the need for a multifaceted approach.
Okay.
You know, it's not just about law enforcement.
Right.
It's about education, community engagement,
Uh-huh.
and addressing the underlying social and economic factors that contribute to the rise of extremism.
Say that they are living paycheck to paycheck.
You will be wealthier.
My wife and I were flipping our first house.
When you shift the way you see things, then your life is going to shift.
Money is a tool for what you want. Money is not what you want. You don't want money.
So that goes to show that you don't have faith when you do not take your money and put it into those accounts to earn interest. When you're scared thinking that something is going to happen, God says, who are you trusting in? Because I'm the one that has created the money system.
Well, I then got offered $350 million for my company.
It says you owe about $538,000.
That the individual and the individual family unit is responsible for filling their own cups.
I went from being homeless and living on the street to owning properties in Baltimore.
And that's why I decided to start a bank.
So we need to look at the root causes, not just the symptoms.
Exactly. It's about creating a society where white supremacy isn't tolerated,
Right.
where diversity is celebrated, and where everyone feels safe and valued.
That's a powerful vision.
It is, and it's one worth striving for.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Yeah,
It's challenging, but also incredibly important.
it is, and it's a conversation that needs to continue.
For sure.
We can't afford to be complacent or pretend that this isn't a serious issue.
You know, as we're talking, I keep coming back to that phrase, enemy within.
Yeah.
It's so powerful, and it really gets to the heart of the issue.
Uh-huh.
We often think of white supremacy as something that exists out there on the
Right.
fringes of society.
Yeah.
But German is arguing that it's much more insidious than that.
It is.
It's woven into the fabric of our institutions,
Yeah.
including the very ones that are supposed to protect us.
It's a difficult truth to confront.
It is.
It forces us to question our assumptions about law enforcement, about the justice system, and about the very nature of our society.
It's like we're being asked to look in the mirror and acknowledge that the enemy isn't just out there.
Right.
It's also within us.
Yeah.
Within our systems, within our structures.
Wow.
And maybe even within ourselves.
And that's where the real work begins.
Right.
It's about examining our own biases, our own complicity, and our own responsibility to create change.
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
It's not enough to simply be aware of the problem.
Right.
We have to actively work to dismantle it.
Absolutely.
And what does that work look like? What are some concrete steps individuals can take to make a difference? Let's explore that further in part 2 of this deep dive. Don't go anywhere.
Okay.
All right, see you soon.
Yeah. You know, picking up on that question of what can we do, I think it's important to understand just how widespread this problem actually is.
Okay, yeah. Give it to me straight.
Okay, so remember how we were talking about the lack of data
Uh-huh.
on white supremacist violence?
Oh, yeah. That was a pretty disturbing revelation.
It's even more problematic when you consider that white supremacist groups have been responsible for some of the most deadly terrorist attacks in recent U.S. history.
I mean, I know there have been some high-profile cases.
Right.
But are we talking about a really significant number of attacks?
Yes, and the data we do have paints a very alarming picture.
Okay.
So according to a report by the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, or START for short,
Okay.
white supremacists and far-right extremists have been responsible for the majority of terrorist attacks on U.S. soil since 1990.
Wow. I have to admit, I didn't realize it was that widespread.
And here's another startling statistic.
Yeah.
A 2020 report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies found that right-wing extremist attacks and plots have been increasing at an alarming rate,
Okay.
nearly quadrupling in the U.S. between 2017 and 2019.
Those are some pretty sobering numbers.
Yeah.
It really underscores the urgency of this issue.
It does, and what makes it even more challenging is that these groups are constantly evolving. They're using social media to recruit and spread their ideology. And they're becoming increasingly sophisticated in their tactics.
So it's not just about like neo-Nazis marching in the streets anymore.
Not at all.
Yeah.
We're seeing a much more subtle and insidious form of white supremacy emerging. One that's harder to identify and even harder to combat.
Yeah.
Think about the alt-right movement, for example.
Oh, okay.
They're using internet memes, online forums, and even seemingly harmless platforms like video games to spread their message and recruit new members.
Wow. That's a really scary thought.
Yeah.
It feels like it's becoming harder and harder to separate fact from fiction online.
Right.
And that can be a breeding ground for extremism.
You're absolutely right. And it makes the need for accurate information and critical thinking skills even more crucial.
Okay, so given all of this, what can we as individuals do? What steps can we take to push back against this tide of white supremacy?
Well, I think the first step is education. We need to understand the history of white supremacy in this country, how it has manifested in different forms over time,
Okay.
and how it continues to impact us today.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly. The more we understand about the roots of this problem,
Yeah.
the better equipped we'll be to challenge it. And there are some great resources out there that can help with this.
Okay. Like what?
So, for example, the Southern Poverty Law Center has a wealth of information on hate groups and extremist ideologies. And the Equal Justice Initiative has done incredible work documenting the history of racial injustice in America.
Okay, so education is key. But what about taking action? What can we do beyond just reading up on this stuff?
Well, another important step is to challenge racism and bigotry
Okay.
whenever and wherever we encounter it.
Right.
And this can be uncomfortable, but it's crucial. Silence is complicity.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed or powerless in the face of something as big and systemic as white supremacy. But we all have a sphere of influence, whether it's our family, our workplace, or our online communities.
Exactly. And even small acts of resistance can make a difference.
Like what?
If you hear someone make a racist joke, speak up.
Okay.
If you see someone being harassed or discriminated against, intervene. If you notice a pattern of bias in your workplace or community, call it out.
Okay.
These actions might seem small, but they send a powerful message that white supremacy will not be tolerated.
So it's about creating a culture of accountability, both on an individual and a societal level.
Precisely. And it's also about supporting organizations that are working to combat white supremacy and promote racial justice.
Can you give some examples of the kind of organizations you're talking about?
Sure. So the NAACP, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Anti-Defamation League Color of Change, Showing Up for Racial Justice, Black Lives Matter,
Okay.
are all doing incredible work on the ground. They need our support, whether it's through donations, volunteering, or simply amplifying their message.
That's a great list. I think sometimes people are hesitant to get involved because they're afraid of doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing.
I understand that fear, but it's important to remember that we're all learning and growing.
Right.
None of us are going to be perfect allies,
For sure.
but we can all strive to be better.
Yeah.
And there are resources available to help us along the way.
Okay.
There are workshops, trainings, and online communities where we can learn about anti-racism work and develop our skills as allies.
I love that. So it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to show up, to learn, and to do the work.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
We're not going to dismantle white supremacy overnight.
Yeah.
It's going to take sustained effort and commitment from all of us.
So how do we stay motivated? How do we avoid getting burned out or discouraged when the progress feels slow?
That's a great question. I think it's important to find ways to connect with other people who are doing this work. There's strength in numbers, and being part of a community can help us stay grounded and hopeful.
It's about finding your tribe, those people who share your values.
Yeah.
And who are committed to fighting for justice.
Yes. And it's also important to celebrate the wins.
Yeah.
No matter how small they may seem.
Right.
Every step forward, every act of resistance, every person we reach is a victory.
So it's about finding that balance between acknowledging the enormity of the problem and recognizing the power of our individual actions.
Exactly. And it's about never giving up hope, because a better world is possible, but we have to fight for it.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about the history of white supremacy, its modern manifestations, and the steps individuals can take to combat it. But what about the role of law enforcement and the justice system?
That's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
And it's something that Mike German addresses in his book.
Uh-huh.
He argues that we need to fundamentally rethink how we approach policing in this country.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What does a reimagined system of law enforcement look like? And how do we get there? We'll explore those questions and more in the final part of this deep dive. Stay tuned. Welcome back. So we've talked about the history of white supremacy and its modern forms and the steps that individuals can take to combat it.
Right.
But we left off with this big question of how do we reimagine the role of law enforcement and the justice system?
Right, because we know that simply giving law enforcement more power
Right.
or resources isn't the answer.
Right.
In fact, as Mike German argues, it could actually make the problem worse.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially given the historical connection between law enforcement and white supremacy that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. So instead of doubling down on the same old strategies, German suggests we need to take a step back and ask some fundamental questions.
It's what?
What is the true purpose of policing? Who is it actually serving?
Okay.
And how can we create a system that is truly just and equitable for all?
Those are some big questions.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin to unpack all of that?
Well, German argues that one of the first steps is to shift away from this warrior mentality that has permeated police culture for decades.
What do you mean by warrior mentality? Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. It's this idea that police officers are like soldiers on the front lines of a war against crime,
Okay.
constantly facing danger and needing to use force to maintain control. And this mindset can lead to an us versus them dynamic,
Okay.
where officers view the communities they serve as potential enemies rather than partners.
So it creates this adversarial relationship instead of a collaborative one.
Precisely. And this can be especially problematic in communities of color,
Right.
where historical injustices and systemic racism have already created a deep sense of mistrust towards law enforcement.
That makes a lot of sense. So if we want to move away from this warrior mentality, what needs to change?
Well, German suggests that we need to start by changing the way police officers are trained.
Okay.
Instead of focusing primarily on physical tactics and weapons handling. Right. We need to prioritize de-escalation techniques, conflict resolution, community engagement skills.
So more emphasis on communication and building relationships,
Right.
and less on brute force.
Exactly. And this shift in training needs to be accompanied by a change in police culture as well.
How do you change something as ingrained as police culture? That seems like a pretty daunting task.
It definitely won't be easy. But German argues that it's essential if we want to create real lasting change.
Okay.
He suggests that we need to start holding officers accountable for their actions, promoting transparency and oversight, and creating a system where misconduct is not tolerated.
So it's about creating a system where there are consequences for bad behavior and incentives for good behavior?
Right. And it's about shifting the focus from punishment to rehabilitation, both for officers and for the communities they serve.
Can you give an example of what that might look like in practice?
Sure. Instead of automatically resorting to arrest and incarceration for low-level offenses,
Okay.
we could invest in community-based programs that address the root causes of crime,
Okay.
like poverty, lack of opportunity, and mental health issues.
So it's about treating people with dignity and respect,
Yeah,
even when they've made mistakes.
exactly. And it's about recognizing that everyone deserves a chance at redemption.
These are some really powerful ideas.
Yeah.
And I think they offer a lot of hope for creating a more just and equitable system of law enforcement.
I agree.
But is this something that's actually achievable? I mean, we're talking about systemic change.
Right.
And that's never easy.
You're right. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think it's important to remember that change is always possible.
So true. So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do to be a part of this movement for change?
Well, first and foremost, we need to keep the conversation going.
Okay.
Talk to your friends, family, and community members about these issues. Share what you've learned from this deep dive.
Right.
The more awareness we raise, the more pressure we can put on our elected officials to implement these kinds of reforms.
So it's about using our voices to demand a better system.
Absolutely. And we can also support organizations that are working on police reform and criminal justice reform.
Okay.
Groups like the ACLU, the Sentencing Project, and the Equal Justice Initiative are doing incredible work to challenge the status quo and advocate for change.
That's a great point. It's important to put our money and our energy where our values are.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of local action. Get involved in your community. Attend city council meetings.
Okay.
Hold your local law enforcement agencies accountable.
So it's about showing up,
Yeah,
both literally and figuratively.
precisely. And remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
There will be setbacks and challenges along the way, but we can't afford to give up.
Yeah.
The stakes are too high.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
This has been an incredibly insightful and thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration and discovery.
Yes.
We hope this has inspired you to learn more, to get involved, and to be a part of the movement for a more just and equitable world.
Remember, change starts with each of us.
Until next time, keep diving deep.